It was just after 11 a.m. and the sun had barely risen. From its place just above the horizon, it cast golden beams of light across the frosty landscape. The stillness of the night had given way to a strong gale from the east, carrying with it lashings of hailstones that periodically obscured the view in opaque, fast-moving curtains. I was walking towards the northern tip of the isle. There, the sea was visible on three sides. White-tipped waves moved urgently, with little space between them as they splashed against the rocky shore. The cold of the wind hurt my face, so I pulled my scarf closer around me, my gloved hand keeping tight hold of the bucket that the wind kept threatening to rip from my grasp. 2 Shetland ponies, a mare and a foal, stood sheltered in the lee of the hill, watching my approach. Despite the storm that raged all around me, there was a sense of peace as I walked towards them. So many must have walked this way, in this weather, carrying feed for their animals. I felt my footsteps join theirs, separated only by time. So I started my book with that moment, which was when I was walking towards 2 ponies that I had on loan, a mare called Sugar and her foal Yukon. And the reason I started with that was because it was on that walk that morning where the things I'd been researching suddenly just felt more real and more tangible to me. And I'd come up to Shetland to do research for my PhD, and that in itself was quite an unexpected thing to do. You know, I hadn't done any academic work since I'd finished my undergraduate degree. I'd been living in Glasgow and working mostly in the fields of homelessness, residential mental health and those sorts of areas, and I absolutely loved it, you know, loved the work. But unfortunately it was always temporary contracts, and by temporary I mean 3 months at a time. Would it be renewed? Could I pay the rent? How long would I have a job for? And I'm also not a particularly city person. And just as this was really beginning to get to me and I was getting quite anxious, I went on holiday to Shetland and, well, it was to a wedding, and just completely fell in love with the place. And I just kept thinking about going back, and for some reason the logical way to do that was to do a PhD. So I moved up to Aberdeen to start. I started doing my Master of Research year, applying for PhD funding, which I was doing while working 40 hours a week, so it was already quite a full-on year, but I was incredibly lucky to get funding through a project called Arctic Domus. And it was based at Aberdeen University, but it connected to several other universities. And the premise of it was to research human-animal relationships in the north. So there was people working I had colleagues working with the Gwich'in First Nation and dogs, with Yupik people and salmon, reindeer in Siberia. So there was quite a range of northern places and northern animals. And of course I was Shetland ponies. And what they were trying to do was to see if there was a type of northern domestication, a theme that ran through all these different contexts. And they did find that there was incredible similarities between these places, and the particular focus that I'd maybe speak about today is how through domestication people were looking to keep their animals clever and give them a bit of autonomy, not to sort of overly domesticate them. So that was a theme that ran through everybody's projects. So I had got the place in this PhD and I moved up in 2015 in January. This was to be 1 year of research, and you know, I'm still here. I just completely loved Shetland and stayed. But I moved up in January, which is quite an interesting time to arrive in Shetland, especially if you've never lived this far north before. And I stayed in the island of Walsall, so I had a ferry journey to and from the mainland. And I just remember when I first moved, just the wind, just the constantness of the wind, which was, I'd expected it, but there's expecting it and feeling it. And, you know, like hanging out laundry and being smacked in the face and having neighbours returning items. And I think the thing there was a day where I was just watching the sea and there was like huge waves, or what I thought was huge waves. So I phoned the ferry information line just to check the ferry was still running, that I could get home okay because of the weather. And they were just like, what weather? It's a fine day. And I just realised that what I thought of as wind just wasn't wind. So what I was doing in the PhD research was basically spending time with crofters and pony breeders across Shetland. I think it was around 25 different studs that I worked with, and there was also quite a lot of crofters and other folk that worked with the land. So some people I would visit just once, sometimes it was visits at different times of year to see different types of activities, and really it was all just to build a picture of the shared lives of people and ponies here in Shetland. The PhD itself I completed in 2019, and the title was, I should have checked what my title was. It was True Island Type Ponies, Domestication, Home and Landscape in Shetland. I think that sounds about right. I didn't even write it down. So I submitted the PhD and started thinking about trying to turn it into a book, which took a bit of a process. I was speaking to publishers, and they basically advised that all books, nature writing needs to be done in the style of a memoir. And there's a very big difference between a memoir and a PhD thesis. So it was like going straight back to the beginning. But it was important for me to do it because I really wanted to. I mean, nobody reads your PhD with the best will in the world. Even family probably don't read it. And I just wanted to share the stories of the people and the place and all of these things that had happened. So that's basically how it became the book. And it tells 3 interconnected stories that just sort of weave their way throughout the book. The first being my journey to live in Shetland, the sort of settling in, the getting to know people and the communities. Also the story of Shetland ponies and the people who love them, and just these stories of people, ponies and landscape. And then I relate that to wider ideas about domestication and how we live with animals. I woke to a world transformed. An uncanny silence after weeks of battering winds revealed a snow-covered landscape. Flakes drifted slowly down, their gentle descent through motionless air, a stark contrast to the horizontal hailstones that had stung my face just the day before. With their blanket of snow, the surrounding hills appeared smaller and closer, their shape softened. Sheep with icicled fleeces grazed by the roadside. I drove slowly over the uneven track that led to the small croft where Bjorn was already outside, wearing a bright knitted jumper and woolen hat, and carrying a feed bucket. He greeted me enthusiastically as his German shepherd Amina chased the snowballs he threw. "Come with me," he said. "It's time to feed the ponies." As a young boy growing up in Norway, Bjorn had fallen in love with horses. His first horse had been a Shetland pony, and over the years his passion for the breed had grown. Admitting with a grin that he never did anything by halves, Bjorn said, "So I had to move to Shetland, for the ponies." After years of planning, visiting and dreaming, he and his partner had settled in Shetland where they had a pony stud with around 80 Shetland ponies. "Look around," he gestured. "This is the home of the Shetland pony. It's where they belong and they love it here." We stepped into the closest field and tiny ponies soon approached. Golden palomino, rich chestnut, dark brown and many colours in between shone against the white of the ground. Their breath visible in the cold, they whickered to each other and nuzzled at Bjorn's hands. A brown and white pony came over and sniffed at my pockets before starting to chew a section of my hair. I felt a sudden rush of joy as I felt the warmth of its body and the sweet scent of hay surrounded me. "These are the Peary foals. They get extra feed as it's their first winter," he said, as he placed food into their troughs. The starlings who'd been perched ready on the fence began to come closer, eating any food that the ponies had dropped. A loud baying echoed through the still landscape as a small flock of sheep galloped to join us. Leading them was a large Murret ram with impressive horns and several multicoloured Shetland sheep. "You'll have to wait," Bjorn told the noisy crowd. "Harbour will deliver hard feed tomorrow, and then you'll get some." The sheep ignored his words and continued to follow us as we walked through the fields, dashing up to us and baying insistently every time we stopped. Once the ponies close to the croft had been fed, it was time to find the hill herd. Although he was pleased that the frost had brought an end to the winter's squelchy mud, Bjorn was concerned that the sudden extreme cold would make fresh, unfrozen water difficult to find. Armed with a length of metal pipe, Bjorn and I set off across the hill. As we walked, he pointed out walls, ridges and hollows that are favourite places for his ponies to shelter from bad weather. I listened, amazed at his knowledge and how differently he saw the land. For me, it appeared as an empty expanse, but for Bjorn, it was home to his horses, filled with stories and significant places. He crisscrossed the fields, moving directly to all the places where he knew there was usually water. Every time, he found it frozen. He'd break through the ice with a metal pole, only to find more layers of thicker ice underneath. As he checked the few remaining places for water, he appeared worried. "This has never happened before," he said. "We need to get water to the horses." In the distance, some horses were standing, their shapes dark against the snowy landscape. One horse, an older mare called Leandra, started to move towards us. "She's thirsty, and she'll need our help," Bjorn said as she approached. Before she reached us, Leandra turned and walked towards the hill, where she stopped and seemed to be drinking, even though there was no sign of water. Once we were beside her, we could see a small puddle, which, on closer inspection, was being fed by a stream just below the ground that remained unfrozen. Bjorn started to dig at the area, making the hole bigger so it was easier for the other ponies to drink from. I was amazed. Not only had Leandra known how to find water, but she'd effectively shared that knowledge with Bjorn and the other ponies in the herd. As we walked, Bjorn told me, "Here the ponies are in the right environment. It's the same as if you wanted to make wine, for example. You wouldn't live in Norway or here. I'm a great believer that if you're going to breed good ponies, you need the right environment." He described how the Shetland pony became the way it is today because of centuries of living within Shetland's landscapes, walking long distances to find food and learning to shelter from the elements. Like many other pony breeders I would meet, Bjorn emphasised the importance of giving ponies a chance to live in this type of environment that's natural for them. It's by living in this type of place, with freedom to think and learn, that they gain the type of intelligence Leandra had displayed. She was able to find water where her human owner could not. With this knowledge, she could lead the herd to water, keeping them safe in this frozen landscape. This ability to adapt to changing and challenging environmental conditions is one of the most valued characteristics in Shetland ponies. Even in Shetland, it can be difficult to keep ponies naturally, as there's no longer the huge areas of hill grazing that was once common. But Bjorn was trying to recreate the types of landscape Shetland ponies would have traditionally lived in by making inventive use of his land. Throughout winter, he continually monitored the conditions of the fields and the health of the ponies to ensure he didn't give too much or too little feed. And when possible, he kept ponies in large areas of hill park where they could move around to find food and shelter for themselves. Even if they didn't spend all their lives in fields like this, having some experience of this natural life would help keep alive their knowledge and natural instincts. As we returned to the road, a lone sheep walked towards us and then stood still, her yellow eyes fixed on us. Bjorn sighed and threw some hay to her. She immediately started to eat, not taking her eyes off us. Bjorn told me how sad he is for this sheep. "There was 2 sheep," he said, "always together. But one died and now this one's always alone. I always give her some hay to make her a little happier." We watched as this lonely sheep, her head and back covered in ice and snow, finished her hay and walked slowly back to the hill. Over the following months, I would learn that this type of love and attention towards Shetland native breeds is an important part of how people share a landscape with these wise, adaptable breeds. When I talk about the history of Shetland ponies, I'll often say it's a story of love and survival against the odds. And that's because making a living from Shetland landscapes is something that's always been very difficult. With at 60 degrees north and with nowhere more than 3 miles from the sea, you can have salt-laden gale force winds from any direction at any time of year. And sometimes in the winter, these gales can go on for days and weeks at a time. The land itself has very few cultivatable areas and lots of expanses of exposed hill ground. And traditionally, Shetland households needed to be almost entirely self-sufficient and produce everything they needed to survive, and this was the land that they had. It would have been completely impossible to live here without the Shetland native breeds. And the native breeds include everything from types of corn and oats and vegetables, right through to poultry and the domestic cattle and sheep. So households would have usually had a Shetland cow, which they're a little bit less hardy than the other breeds, but they would be able to produce enough milk for the whole household. The Shetland sheep, of course, very hardy, could live out in the rough hill ground and provide wool and meat. And of course, Shetland ponies. We don't know exactly when Shetland ponies first came to Shetland. Definitely been here since the Bronze Age, possibly before, but certainly here for thousands of years, living in these landscapes in this weather, which has really made them what they are. And the small size conserves heat, but it also gives them the chance to hide away down in shelter through peat banks or in the lee of hills. They've got a thick waterproof and windproof coat, and of course when it's really stormy, they've got thick mane and tail. They can just turn bums to the wind, head down and weather the storm. So some of the most loved and identifiable features of the Shetland pony are just all because of them growing up, evolving in this environment. And they were such an important part of lives and landscapes, doing probably the job they're most famous for is bringing home the peat, where, peat was essential to crofters. There wasn't many trees, there wasn't wood that could be used for the fire. And so people would cut peat from the hill at the beginning of the year, and then towards the end of summer, bring that peat home, often in quite inaccessible areas, going over rough ground. And the Shetland ponies would carry that peat in baskets on their side called kishies. But as well as that, they were used for a long time as, there's only been an integrated road network here last 150 or so years. Before, most travel was done by boat, with people going between different communities along the coast, but almost all overland transport was done by Shetland pony. And we think of them as being a child's riding horse, but of course they are strong enough to be able to carry adults, and frequently did. So when I first started looking into the idea of a breed and what a breed means was before I moved up. I was doing the research year in Aberdeen, and we're so used to thinking of animals as being in breeds, different breeds of horses, different breeds of dog. We might have ideas about what each breed means, what it means to be a particular breed of horse or dog. And animals have always taken on different forms depending on the work they were doing and the types of environment they lived in. But the very idea of a breed as a separate thing, that you breed to be a breed, is actually a lot more recent, really just from the 19th century onwards. And these initial experiments in breeding animals and creating breeds was mostly done by people with a lot of time and a lot of money. Really sort of members of the aristocracy. And reading the sort of descriptions of breed creation from this time, it's really interesting how all of these narratives focus on the breeder as designer, as creating a breed. It's their skill, and the animals are very passive in the process. They don't seem to have many opinions or much, they are like clay to be moulded rather than participants in a process. And this tied in a lot with ideas of human mastery over nature. And it was used a lot to reinforce and promote the aristocracy's control over not just the animals on their land, but also people that were living on the land that they owned. So when I started thinking about this when moving to Shetland, speaking to people about the history of the Shetland pony breed, and I looked a bit into the history of Shetland. I knew when you start initially looking into Shetland, you get so much stuff on Viking islands. So I'd wondered whether these would be Viking horses, whether that would be what people would be saying. But over and over, people were talking about this crofting history that I spoke about just a minute ago, the idea of Shetland ponies as being part of this history of crofting. And these stories were so different from ideas of a breed being created by an ingenious human. These stories were much more that the Shetland pony was an intelligent companion on the croft, that they were just part of the household, that they had something to offer and should be valued for themselves. And really they were thought of as being a big part of how people survived during this difficult history. A history that was made a lot more difficult by the actions of the lairds in Shetland, the landowners who had an exploitative system of debt bondage that forced the crofters to work in particular ways, and crofters at the time up until 1886 had no security of tenure, so the landlords could just throw them off their land. So in a direct contrast to sort of being a tool of aristocracy to control people on their land, the story of Shetland native breeds was much more a way of surviving despite exploitation and a way of slightly living well and resisting the sort of influence of the landlord. So that was quite interesting at the beginning, and then the more time I spent speaking to people, the more I began to realise how important all these elements of breed history was to contemporary breeding. And I'll try not to go on a tangent here, because I'm always very careful if I'm speaking about that not to give the impression that this is like a nostalgic practice. And I write about that extensively in the PhD and a little in the book. Because quite often a focus in the past is seen as backwards looking, or it's seen as nostalgia or like a false romanticism. And I argue that it isn't. It's actually a very creative and adaptive process. The valuing the history is part of ongoing relationships. Nobody's trying to fix a pony to a particular point in the past. Nobody's trying to recreate anything. It is just trying to keep these relationships and keep these qualities. And just as a couple of quick examples, so many of the things from the past are really important to today. So how cheap ponies were to keep meant they were possible for people to keep. You weren't having to have stables, expensive feed and things like that. And that's still very important. People might not want or have the means to keep big horses that need lots of attention. You could have Shetland ponies, or they're often used as a companion to bigger horses. So again, this hardiness is a way that they are still relevant today. And the sure-footedness that they had to go over the heathery hill, bring home the peach, they were having to lift up their feet, move nicely across the heather, is still very valued for riding ponies, because they're used a lot for riding horses, and they've got this fantastic movement. So things that were relevant in the past are still relevant in new ways today. One of the ways that I found the importance of the history came through was in concerns people had about what might happen if this history was forgotten or not known or ignored. And I'm just going to quickly talk about two of the ways that came through. And one was in ideas about cute. Now, if you've been on any kind of social media and seen a picture of a Shetland pony, there's always comments, oh, they're so cute and things like that. And certainly before I came up here, I'd probably been quite guilty of that. I didn't realise that cute could actually be considered quite a negative thing and quite a controversial way of describing the ponies. And one of the issues with cute is if you think of something that's cute, it's usually something young, it's usually clumsy, maybe not very clever. You'd maybe think a child or a puppy's cute, but you wouldn't maybe say an adult was. There's this feeling of juvenile dependence that can come with it. And that is a stark contrast to the valued working animal that people want their Shetland ponies to be considered as. Cute isn't a problem in itself. It's quite okay for you to have a cute Shetland pony. They're supposed to be fluffy at this time of year. It's completely okay for people to want a pony that looks good, because they're so often used as show ponies. You want them to look nice. That brings a lot of joy. It's more the problem would be if by focusing only on cute and maybe trying to breed smaller ponies and not thinking about the other traits that they have, you could be selecting for cute while accidentally deselecting for personality, good temperament, movement, or something like that. So it's more that other skills might go unnoticed if there's too much of a focus on that. Which leads to the other way that people were concerned, which was ideas of over-domestication. And that would be things like rugging when not necessary, maybe keeping horses in small enclosures, not giving them very much time to think or be themselves or to express their own opinions. And this links back to cute. It's quite related, because if something is considered cute and maybe a little bit childlike, it could be more likely that they're underestimated, that you maybe wouldn't be seeing the intelligence, you maybe wouldn't be looking for it, you maybe wouldn't be giving them a chance. If they don't have the opportunity to show you the skills that they have, and you're maybe not knowing to look for them, then again it could lead to certain things not being bred out, things being bred out that they were not looking to do. And this was tied in with a concern that incorrect or maybe more inconsiderate domestication practices could, in just a few generations, take away from the ponies something that had taken centuries of intergenerational relationships to form. And it's important to say that I'm not just talking about the ponies losing things, it's also people's knowledge, this relationship between people and ponies, this ability to understand each other and to live in the place together. It's about ways that people work with their horses to understand them and work in a way to allow for these qualities to come through. Which brings me back to the idea I said at the beginning about a key part being not trying to overly dominate the horses and giving them room to have their own opinions. And it was one of the things I was really struck with when I first started speaking to people, is how much they knew their horses. I always think it was split almost into three ways. People understood them as equines, and everything that came with them being horses. People understood them as members of the Shetland pony breed with a particular breed history and qualities that came with that, but also individuals, animals with their own preferences, thoughts and feelings, and all of that would come into decisions. But this idea of not trying to overly control, trying to make a horse do something that they weren't suited for, that they didn't particularly like doing. You could maybe make them do it, but they wouldn't enjoy it. They might go on autopilot. The same if you were to work them the whole time without a break, without giving them time to think for themselves. And a key part of how people got to know their horses was, like in the example with Bjorn, was this watching, was seeing, okay, this horse understands this landscape, look, she's shown the others. Which ones do well in bad weather, which ones do badly in bad weather, who follows, who leads, what are the different places in the herd. And just having that attention. It was sometimes very specific. People would go to look for a particular thing or do an activity and learn from their horses in that activity. But it was also just that attention you would have as you went about your daily life, seeing who was doing what. And all of these attributes were understood in relation to the stud aims, the breed history, but also the future options for each pony. And when people were considering, what type of future would this horse have? Are they happy here? Would they maybe be happier if I sold them to a different climate? Would I breed from this one and this one? And all of these sort of decisions. And I hadn't actually been planning to do a reading at this bit, but I realised that this was an area that I have a tendency to waffle. So I'm probably just going to do it as a quick reading, because the idea of the hill came in so much, the landscape and the different roles that the hill could play. Because the hill was often spoken to me as, people would say it was somewhere they could put their horses to relax for a while, they could have some time to be horses, you'd work them, then they'd go in the hill, you'd put young ones in the hill with a herd. Basically a place that the horses could learn, but also the people could learn from them. And that sort of led me to think of the hill as actually being an active participant in domestication. So I was looking at originally domestication as human-animal relationships, and then it became human-animal landscape relationships as I got to know more. Here we go. So this was a bit where I was in Fulla and I was sitting watching a herd of ponies out on the hill there. The hill becomes an important storied place, with each new generation, human and equine, learning from others who have inhabited this landscape. People notice and respond to the changing weather and seasons in relation to their horses, and horses come to understand what to expect from the humans they spend their lives with. This shared attention, practiced over generations, is part of the very fabric of island life. Landscape's not a backdrop to this activity, it shapes and defines it. And loves it, I said aloud as I watched the ponies graze. Love is ever present in pony breeders' relationships, not only with their ponies, but with Shetland itself. I thought back to Tim Ingall's words that, through living in it, the landscape becomes part of us, just as we are part of it. Through living in this place, cultivating relationships with land and animals, embodying stories from the past while creating new connections into the future, pony breeders have truly become part of Shetland as Shetland has become part of them. As we live in this world, our thoughts, actions and intentions shape our interactions with those other than ourselves. We become who we are through our relationships with others. The very essence of our being created and co-created through these connections. The next reading, which just for a bit of context of where I am with it, it was about a year into my field work. I'd had a miscarriage that had a lot of complications and, a lot of hospital time. And then I was pregnant again and having more complications with that pregnancy. Which that pregnancy turned into Rowan, who's now 6 and keeps adding poo to every sentence he's saying at the moment. It's driving everyone bonkers. So yeah, it did have a good outcome, but there was this period of anxiety. And that's something I end up writing quite a bit about at various bits, because looking at how animals and landscapes, how these connections can be healing and also contribute to well-being. So I've just got a very short reading from that leading to it. Winter was starting to recede, and the now familiar signs of spring returned. The oyster catchers' shrill cries, fulmar forming pairs and settling into their homes in broken down walls, the bubbling call of curlew. Out in the water, rafts of eider ducks floated past, black and white and brown shapes, their surprised oohs always making me smile, pulling me away from my worries, if only for a moment. The remains of small blue eggshells told me the first broods of starling chicks had arrived, and before long, as soon as I stepped near a stone wall, the clamour of hungry babies in the nest would explode from between the stones. As I walked in the nest, I often stopped to sit on a rock and look out to sea. Seeing me, Yoda, that's my caddy lamb that I write about quite a lot, always left his flock and raced down to stand next to me, grazing inches from my feet. When I reached out to scratch his cheek or neck, he would put his head to one side, often resting on my knee, and close his eyes as he peacefully chewed the cud. There were several days of bright, dry weather where the sun shone and there was only a light breeze. After a long winter, I loved being surrounded by the feel of spring. Yet there was a disconnect. The warmth and stillness seemed at odds with my racing thoughts and frantic worries. I don't know how I would have got through those difficult months if it had not been for the presence of the ponies. I'm sure Yukon knew something was different. In the weeks before I'd become pregnant, she'd not spent much time close to me. She'd been working well in the halter, seeming to enjoy walks on the road, barely paying any notice to her mum's frantic whinnies as I led her out of the field. As soon as we returned and I took her halter off, she would take off full speed, playing, running around, bucking and generally showing off. But the day of the first bleed, as I sat in her field in a terrible limbo, she'd come straight up to me, quietly, her body touching mine, and had stood close. As I'd cried, she'd pressed her face up to mine. Alongside the worry, my clearest memory from that day is the feel of her coat and her warm breath on my face as the world continued around us and we were still. So I'd included that example. It's in the book, and there's also a toned down version of it in the PhD as well, because it was such a similar story to what people were sharing with me. Not just people in Shetland, but people were messaging my Shetland Pony research page so often to talk about times that their horses had just known something wasn't right. times where something significant had happened in their lives, and immediately the behaviour of the horses changed, and they were just there with them in a way that they weren't other times. And I started looking into animal-assisted therapy, where an animal might be used in therapeutic encounters, either within the formal therapy setting, but also things like going into care homes and things like that. And there's a lot of really good science on it. There's good articles that clearly show that the presence of an animal can really boost mood and do things like that. But so much was lacking from all of these studies, where an animal was taken as something that was present or absent. There was an animal here, there was not an animal there. And I'm sure anyone that's known ponies will know that you couldn't just put any Shetland pony into that situation and expect it to work out. It's a very particular skill that the animals have in it. For a horse to be able to understand the human emotion, to think, to understand it, and then act in a way that the human then understands, is an incredibly complex relationship, that there's so much going on there. And I'm going to try and not end up on any tangents here, but it's tricky, because this always brings up ideas of anthropomorphism, which is the fictitious putting of human emotions onto animals. Now, the very idea that a certain emotion is human only is incredibly problematic. It's saying it's only humans can feel these types of emotions, which, again, clearly not true. But a lot of how we think about communication, how we think about relationships with others, is based on quite narrow Western scientific definitions that don't leave much space for things in between. Most of it's based on a sort of theories of mind, where your mind is contained in your body. It's like a separate thing. Everyone's got their mind in their body. The only way that that can be known is by someone to take an action or say words to communicate it. And when you start thinking of emotion and understanding each other's emotions in that way, the idea of cross-species emotion seems like a big jump. But there's a lot more work on consciousness that looks at it as being more of a distributed thing. Understanding comes through relations. It's not things that are sort of contained within us. So thoughts and feelings are something present in the world, unfolding in relationships, not locked inside ourselves. And when you look at it like that, understanding can be seen as being more a process of mutual attunement, an idea of sort of being withness, understanding each other through time together. And then it really isn't that big of a jump at all. It just makes sense that who you're spending time with is affecting you, is affecting them, and an understanding comes from these relationships. And, we often accept that our identities are part of who we spend time with. It's our family, it's our friends, it's our work colleagues. But somehow it's considered, human-animal relationships, it's somehow considered almost less. That would be less than a human relationship. But when you think of it, when we're sharing our lives with non-human others, why would that be a lesser relationship? If you're spending time and gaining that understanding over a lifetime, this is how I end up going on a tangent. And it's just because you so often see relationships with non-humans as being dismissed, as if they're somehow less important than human ones. And sort of looking into how these relationships can be a really big part of who we are and who they are. So when I talk about pony breeders as trying to preserve historic qualities, things like strength and hardiness, they can be quite obvious things that you can pick. Oh, that one's a really hardy pony. But they're also trying to keep these more intangible qualities, intelligence, empathy, and things like that. Because the roles that ponies do so often today, they're often a child's first riding horse, their first experience of their own animal that they are looking after. They're companions to people of all ages, and they are more and more being used for formal therapy work. So these sort of jobs they're doing, the new roles that they're coming into. So it's a big, it's a big part of the breed's future as well as the history. And I'd started thinking about all of this, in relation to well-being more generally, because there's a lot of these memorable encounters where someone had a specific life event where a horse made a particular impact. But I started thinking more of the everyday impact. And I'd been writing about sustainability and how protecting and promoting native breeds is really important for positive island futures, with uncertainty over climate, not knowing how feed and transport costs are going to be. Keeping animals that can thrive in this landscape is a really important way of keeping farming going here. So I'd been writing a lot about livable landscapes, and then I had a typo where I turned it to lovable landscapes. And I realised, well, that's really just what it is. There's a lot of practical reasons to preserve breeds, but it's also a way that people feel connected to the landscapes they love. And I'll finish with a reading that sort of, I think, sums up those ideas from near the end of the book, if I can find it. Yeah, here we go. As I wrote my thesis, I noticed this theme of stories recurring throughout the chapters. I particularly loved these lines written by Anna Singh, and I'm quoting here. Over the past few decades, many kinds of scholars have shown that allowing only human protagonists into our stories is not just an ordinary human bias, it's a cultural agenda tied to dreams of progress through modernisation. There are other ways of making worlds. Anthropologists have become... I've stuck the sticky right over the words I'm reading. That was clever. Anthropologists have become interested, for example, in how subsistence hunters recognise other living beings as persons, that is, protagonists of stories. Indeed, how could it be otherwise? Yet expectations of progress block this insight. Talking animals are for children and primitives. Their voice is silent, we imagine well-being without them. We trample over them for our own advancement. We forget that collaborative survival requires cross-species coordinations. Stories are part of the very fabric that makes our world. They are generative, shaping our lives and what futures are possible. And so the stories we tell about domestication, how humans and animals live together, matter. Historically, much of Western-based knowledge systems, religion, science, philosophy are predicated on a separation between humans and nature. Plants and animals are understood in rather mechanical ways, governed by innate biology responding to stimuli, rather than as sentient beings capable of engaging in meaningful relationships. And it's from within this context that the traditional narratives about domestication which I've sought to challenge emerged. Stories of humans controlling animal lives, either celebrated as civilization's achievement or lamented as the widespread enslavement of non-humans. Domination and violence don't have to be part of domestication relationships, but too often they are. And narratives that imply this is an inevitable part of domestication can legitimise and naturalise these exploitative practices. But when we tell other stories about our lives with domestic animals, stories of love and connection, then these stories become part of our journey with non-humans and can shape our worlds. One line in particular from Singh's earlier quote really stood out to me. We imagine well-being without them. We've told stories of human exceptionalism, our separation from animals and landscapes for so long that many of these connections are becoming forgotten. I'm just skipping a little bit of this. This encourages us to ignore the possibility of more than human interactions and fail to notice the way these worlds affect us, which closes down the possibility of future connections. If our identities are shaped through our relationships with others, then what does this mean for humans? Are we suffering without understanding what we're missing, cut off from networks of relating that we depend upon? And how can we re-engage in ways that cultivate the possibility of mutual flourishing? As I worked with Arctic Domus colleagues to rethink and reimagine domestication, I felt renewed hope about the lives we can live with animals and what this might mean for sustainable futures. I learned that domination was not the founding principle of domestication relationships. It was domus, meaning home. A home shared with animals and a home comprising of myriad meaningful interspecies relationships. This history of shared lives and hopes for positive futures emerged from relationships in time and place. And I came to understand that domestication is an ongoing changing relationship between people and ponies in Shetland. Each live and become with the other, and these relationships matter, shaping ideas of home and belonging. I heard stories, sometimes going back several generations, of the joy that spending time with ponies could bring. Pony breeders would often describe interactions with their animals as therapeutic, recounting incidents where ponies had been an important part of coping with difficult circumstances. I believe, however, the contribution to ponies to health and well-being goes far beyond these memorable encounters. The experience of everyday living with ponies brings people joy. It's a practice of engaging with communities, human and non-human, while connecting to wider ideas about island histories. When people work Shetland crofts, spending time with native breeds, cattle, sheep and ponies, they do so with attention towards generations that came before and those that will come after. People notice the rhythms of their animals' lives, learning from them and with them. Skipping this bit there. Through my time in Shetland, I began to understand domestication as a practice of cultivating a sense of home and belonging in the islands, with home stretching beyond the walls of the house into the surrounding landscapes where animals lived. To be at home in this way is being part of a living, sentient, connected landscape, feeling the ways of the wind, being open to more than human communication. This is a home co-created through domestication relationships, connections stretching through time, keeping alive the stories of the past, connecting them to present-day activities, and actively creating and maintaining a valued way of life into the future. Each day's activities, grooming, feeding, showing, don't happen in isolation. They're part of vast communities between generations of people and ponies, past and present and future. Working in this way, feeling part of the place, actively contributing to the continuation of this way of life, brings joy and a sense of purpose. When writing my thesis, I often use the term livable in relation to these ideas, livable landscapes for people and ponies. But in my conclusion, I made the typo where livable became lovable, and I realised this is exactly what they are, landscapes of love. Love for Shetland and its wild, rugged landscapes of barren hills surrounded by windswept coast. Love for the history of independence despite exploitation and survival against the odds. And of course, love for the animals who allowed this survival and continue to connect people to land and history.